The panel starts in 5 minutes. The panel starts in 5 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Hi, and I hope you enjoyed your coffee break. So this is panel 11, and this is going to be called Democracies Held to Ransom, Organized Crime and Authoritarianism. And speaking to us today about this is a brilliant panel. It's Vanja Chalovic, and she's going to be online. We have Clay Fuller, Alexandra Kupataze, and Boyan Elek. So thank you all very much.
So hello, everyone. Thank you for coming back after the coffee break. I think some more people are standing outside. They will soon join, I hope. Our MC said, this panel today is titled Democracies Held to Ransom, Organized Crime and Authoritarianism. And I just wanted to give a brief technical note. Vanya was unfortunately unable to join us here live, but she's joining us online. I hope you can hear us. Greetings from Belgrade. What does organized crime have to do with authoritarianism, you might ask? And how does it all fit into this global topic of the conference? Research shows that organized criminal groups, networks, seem to perform better in democratic countries. And those of you who are lucky to live in democratic countries with the rule of law, with accountable governments, serious and organized crime is an external challenge that is being prevented, fought against, prosecuted, and there is a clear line that can be drawn between the state and organized crime. However, in authoritarian regimes, and this is where we get to the interesting part of this conference, organized criminal groups not only work equally well, but they are also an integral part of the governance structures, both formally and informally. And the line between the state and organized crime is a more blurred one. And we have many names to call this phenomenon. You can call it a mafia state. Here in Serbia, we use the term captured state. It can be political corruption, authoritarian regime, competitive or electoral authoritarianism. They all focus on different aspects of the phenomenon, but imply that there is something rotten to the core with these countries and societies. This does not actually come as a surprise, because some sociologists have argued that when you strip it down to the core, modern states actually work much like organized criminal networks. They have organized violence as the key characteristic, and they provide protection and extract rent in return for this protection. So one in the form of taxes, other in the form of racketeering. And this might sound like a very outlandish argument, but on the second thought, it is much more realistic than, for example, social contract theory, which says that people get together and decide to create a country or a state. So in the world of rising authoritarianism, democratic backsliding, we talked about all of these things here in Belgrade. We see also the rise of transnational organized crime, and it seems like it's a perfect storm. So one of the things that we will be discussing is how to reverse this trend, and I have these excellent three panelists to try to do that and help me to achieve that goal. So the way we will proceed, we have several rounds of questions, and we will start from a more global perspective and then zero in on the Balkans. And let's start with you, Clay, first. Thank you for flying all over here from Texas. So you write extensively on what you call authoritarian corruption nexus, to add more things to the list of names that I mentioned. And if I read, no worries. And if I read it correctly, the argument goes that the very existence of authoritarian regimes depends on these criminal networks. So could you care to elaborate on that concept?
Yes, so thank you very much for the invitation, for being here at this truly global and very inclusive conference here. So I published a report that introduced this new concept of dismantling the authoritarian corruption nexus. Now, what is that? I call it the growing convergence of licit and illicit state and non-state actors that facilitate and launder the proceeds of illegal activity all around the world. And what this is doing is it's strengthening authoritarian regimes all around the world and giving them new legs and ways to get into democracies and undermine those democracies. So you start out by sort of saying, what is it that we know about dictatorships empirically? Through all the research and the numbers and everything we've done, we know that all dictatorships are involved in every single war and conflict around the world. We know that all dictatorships are the worst of human rights abusers around the world. And you can draw a straight line between transparency and corruption. The more democratic a country gets, the more transparent it gets. The more authoritarian a country gets, the more corrupt it gets. It's a very, very stark relationship between the two. So when it comes to organized crime, democracies have a free press and the rule of law. So while organized crime exists in all states all around the world, in a country with a free press, a democracy with a free press and the rule of law, it gets caught and exposed and brought into the limelight way more often than it does in a non-democratic state. And then, because in democracies we have free speech, it often gets glorified even in movies, television shows, even video games. And so it is perceived by the world as being very, very prevalent in these countries. But the way I see it is that organized crime thrives even more in a almost like symbiotic relationship with the state in an authoritarian state. They sort of depend on each other, scratch each other's backs. In an authoritarian state where there's high levels of corruption and very little transparency, organized crime groups are allowed to operate basically if and only if they keep loyalty to the regime. So if they're loyal to the leader of the autocracy, then they're just basically given a blank check to do almost anything they want. And then when the dictator needs them to do something for them, the dictator knows that they're there and then can use them as a sort of informal arm of the state. So to give you just like a little bit of an example of how this kind of works, most of the cocaine in the world is produced in Latin America, right? And then it gets shipped to West Africa. They'll buy used cars, they'll pack it in the cars, they'll ship it to West Africa, then they'll smuggle it across West Africa into the Balkans, where then it gets repackaged, shipped, sold into Europe. This happens with fentanyl from China coming to Mexico, to Venezuela, Colombia, other places where it gets repackaged and it's smuggled up into my great state of Texas. And what happens is all this activity creates a lot of illicit profits, money that they need to do something with. And so then from there, they have to move it somewhere. And where do they move it? They move it into Western countries that have the rule of law and have protections and have transparencies because they can protect it there. Right? So they hire lawyers, they create shell companies, they buy real estate in Florida, they buy a yacht and park it off the coast of Delaware because they don't want to keep it back in their own non-transparent, corrupt countries. But so if you think about this cocaine flowing that way and the fentanyl flowing this way, you have all these different actors along the way that even if they were not organized crime to begin with, they're being taught a trade, basically, that then they can take along with what they've learned and use for their own personal gain after they've learned it. And this is basically what the nexus is. And this has existed for a really long time, but it is getting worse and growing and expanding as the global economy grows and expands and becomes more interconnected.
Yeah, thank you, Clay. And then you mentioned the rule of law, and we do talk about rule of law a lot here, especially now that we are in the very long process of kind of joining the EU. This is one of the priorities for reforms here. And then you mentioned something that I like, that the authoritarian regimes disseminate a lot of data and then do it not because they rule by law as opposed to have a rule of law, which is what exactly you just mentioned, that they prefer rule of law to protect their assets, but then prefer to operate in the more non-democratic and less rule of law countries. So moving on to Alexander, I read the introduction to your book that you published a couple of years ago, Organized Crime, Political Transitions and State Formation in Post-Soviet Eurasia. So this is now the region that we are trying to kind of focus on before we move on to the Balkans. And the introduction, you start with painting an image, which is something that we also hear around these parts. You go through a city, and then the poshiest place with the most beautiful houses, these houses belong to police officers, prosecutors, judges, politicians. And this is something that we also see here. Our ministers have the best houses, the best cars, things like that. So some 30-odd years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, do we still have what you call in your research gray political zones or transformation that has been stuck in the same place? And how does this all relate to the debate we started?
Well, yes, absolutely. But first of all, I'm very, very glad to be here. Thanks for inviting. And yes, the short answer is yes. I think these countries, or most of them, they're stuck in this kind of bad equilibrium of corruption and illegality. And there is this vicious circle that they're stuck in, and they can get out of it. I also call it permanent state of illegality. So there is, we have very few cases when, not only in post-Soviet Eurasia, but globally, that the countries actually managed to break out of this vicious circle, right? I mean, in post-Soviet Eurasia, we can look at Baltics, right? I mean, Estonia is an absolute champion of anti-corruption reforms, but Baltics are exception. I mean, they've been different case anyway, even during Soviet times, right? We can look at Georgia, and Georgia has done a great deal of reforms. In mid-2000s, Georgia was the fastest transforming country in terms of anti-corruption ever registered in history by the indices as measured by the World Bank. So it's quite an achievement. But the problem is it had very limited effects, and that's a very important thing to emphasize, that if you are breaking out of a vicious circle, then you have to put in place the institutions to maintain the progress. Because what we see in Georgia is some reversal, unfortunately, of the progress that has been achieved. So I think, and I think I slightly differ on this with Clay, because I mean, globally, I think we see some correlation between more democracy and less organized crime, but that's not necessarily the case in the places I've been doing research in, post-Soviet cases specifically, because I mean, what political competition means in this case is the competition over the resources. So political competition in developed democracy, that's checks and balances, that's political parties performing better because they're competing for the votes. But what happens in countries like Kyrgyzstan or other countries, that I don't want to mention all of them, is this competition over who is more corrupt rather than who is less corrupt, who has access to which illegal markets, and who is better off in terms of this capacity to extract the rents from illegal markets. And political pluralism in this case basically means just more actors, more people who want a share in this pie of corruption and illegal markets. So it just multiplies the people who want to be corrupt. So in that sense, it's really daunting to see that not necessarily you have this correlation. And again, since I mentioned Kyrgyzstan, I will go on with Kyrgyzstan. It's more democratic than many of these neighbors, but it's even more corrupt, and it's even more impacted by organized crime than Tajikistan or other countries. And I think you can say that about Belarus if you compare it to Moldova historically. I mean, things have been improving in Moldova dramatically. So I think over time, these actors, mechanisms, and practices, they change. I mean, it's not like in the 90s anymore when organized crime would extort fees from the entrepreneurs, right? I mean, it's not this type of extortion rackets. Now it's semi-legal kind of forms like corporate writing that actually needs the involvement of formal institutions like courts, right? But the underlying idea is the same. That is illegality and corruption that's kind of developed into an alternative way of doing things, or alternative way of governance. But what I think is important, and that's my last point here, is that in authoritarian regimes we see a lot of collusion. That is, Collusion to the extent, the collusion between state and organized crime, to the extent that it's no longer useful to distinguish corruption from organized crime. Because whatever and wherever you look at, most of the criminal activities there, they have some kind of involvement of state-embedded or state-affiliated actors. They either protect or participate or manage in a very direct ways. And since Clay mentioned drugs, I mean, if you want to understand drug trafficking through Central Asia, you have to look at police generals rather than underworld mafia bosses, right? So I will stop.
Thank you. That was a great segue into Vanya. Vanya, can you hear us? I hope yes. We are now focusing on the Balkans. You coming from Montenegro and being expert on this topic in the region, can you provide an assessment of how we ended up here? And I would like to ask you to maybe go back to the 90s. Let's take the same, maybe 30 years time slot. If you could tell what was the role of organized crime and how it contributed to state building in this part of the world?
Thank you very much for invitation. I'm really sorry that I wasn't able to join you in person today, and I hope there will be another opportunity. When we are talking about organized crime in the Balkans, it is important to understand that during the 90s, when ex-Yugoslavia fell apart and the war started, criminal groups continued to cooperate. These criminal groups benefited also from specific knowledge that existed among members of structures such as police, secret police, the army. So people who were trained, in whom the state was actually investing in developing their specific skills, who were recruited by organized crime, or who were actually working on behalf of the state hand in hand with organized crime. Because countries like, for example, Montenegro, but certainly not only in Montenegro, in the Balkans, actually engaged in state-organized crime. It was justified to the population that, for example, Montenegro was engaging in trafficking of cigarettes because that money is being used for providing social support to the people in need or pensions to the elderly population, etc. Of course, in practice, it wasn't working like that. In practice, first of all, significant part of the money was going into the private pockets, of course, and these linkages that were developed with criminal groups outside of the country and criminal groups inside Montenegro continued to exist even after a state officially abandoned the trafficking business and the illicit activities. After the sanctions were over, after the war was over, these criminal structures continued to operate within the most sensitive institutions which were supposed to fight against organized crime. Some of their friends from the 90s were even officially on the other side of the law, but this cooperation actually was a fertile soil for continuation of such activities. And you would find in academic theory a lot of evidences that there was no political structure that willingly engaged in dismantling the channels for any kind of illicit activities. That was the case in Montenegro as well. However, since the state was not anymore officially involved in the crime was evolving. The state was trying to prove that there are actually some reforms happening, but in practice, they were engaging in creating such a system that was providing incentives for organized crime, that was providing so many spaces for maneuver that actually the state continued to be supportive to criminal activities. Of course, we would be naive not to think that the criminals were returning it back to the politicians that were allowing it to happen, including at the elections. So some of them even officially claimed, like stated in public, in media, in some interviews, criminals that are on wanted lists even by the United States of America, for example. I'm referring, for example, to Nasser Kelmendi. They said that they were actually funding some political activities and some in relation to some of the elections related to Montenegro. So in that sense, The problem of organized crime in the Balkans is that their capacities grow, their connections with criminal groups from other countries, especially with Italy, but also with Latin America. And we are seeing that from more recent cases that they have actually established very close links with groups that are producing cocaine in Latin America, and that quality of the drugs that is coming to Balkans is increasing. So the problem was even more complicated because of these strong linkages between the state and political actors and criminal actors. In some cases, they merged. In some cases, the lines got so blurred that it's not really easy to recognize who's working for the state in the official capacity and who's at the same time working for the criminals. So we had some high-level public officials who were actually involved in these shell companies that were used by the criminals. Any case that was exposed in the past, instead of being investigated by the institutions, people who were exposing those cases were the ones investigated, because the crime actually captured the state. And most importantly, captured the institutions that are supposed to fight against crime. So any reforms in these institutions that were implemented by the people who were at the top level of the hierarchy were enabling organized crime to continue, because various loopholes in laws and practices were purposely left so they could be exploited by the criminals. And we evidence that throughout the Balkans. Unfortunately, we didn't use the opportunity during the investigation of the war crimes in the Balkans to follow the money, because the very same money that was made during the war continued to be laundered through the so-called transition, continued to be invested into our countries and presented as clean money coming from abroad. And the politicians who were working hand in hand with criminals were enabling and facilitating the laundering of the proceeds of crime. So the problem in Montenegro is way more complicated than in a country whose governments, whose top-level politicians, in some cases from both sides of the political spectrum, were engaged in criminal activities as their official business during the 90s.
Thank you, Vanya. And I think you touched upon the things that I wanted to run in the second round of questions. So maybe let's continue with you. Could you maybe connect the dots between what happened, the events that you described, and more recent events in Montenegro, change of the government, and how this all is playing out, considering the links that you mentioned? We've been following, it was quite an interesting 2 years period, I would say, in Montenegro. So if you can maybe tell us more about that.
Yes, it is an interesting 2 years period in Montenegro, where unfortunately reforms continue to be delayed. I think that quite a number of reasons exist there, including political crises that exist and foreign influences, of course. But I think that one of the reasons for delaying some of the reforms in areas that are prone to organized crime are delayed in particularly because criminal structures, different criminal structures are taking over the businesses and or transferring and taking over different political, supporters. And we do have some evidences to that. We can see that, unfortunately, in the case of Montenegro, in the blackest spot when it comes to smuggling of cigarettes, but also smuggling of cocaine, the free trade zone of the port of Bar, we saw absolutely no reforms. In 2 years, absolutely no reforms. There was a confiscation of the cigarettes that were sitting in the free trade zone, but actually during the destruction process, the cigarettes were disappearing, and now some people from the new government are accused of being involved in these activities. The problem is that they are being accused by the other political structure which was involved in those activities for about 30 years. So the biggest problem that we are evidencing now is that it is a relativization of those crimes, that everyone is involved in it, so it doesn't really matter, and there will be no accountability because everyone has a piece in crime. And that's exactly what one of my colleagues was referring to before. And that's the biggest danger that we are experiencing with the change of the government, because people are not saints, people are corruptible. And if they are able to control the system, which is set in such a way to support the crime, to actually facilitate the crime, then these people will sooner or later, these or the others, get corrupted themselves and use these loopholes in the system. That is why it is so important, not only to change the people, which is the first step, because of course, corrupted individuals involved in organized crime won't engage in arresting themselves and taking away their interests. So the first step is political change. But the second step must be the change of the system, not relying on authority of individual or integrity of individual, because we are talking about such a huge amounts of money, about so powerful structures which managed to accumulate huge wealth and influence that we cannot really rely only on integrity of individuals. And I think it is important also to learn a lesson for the EU in the case of organized crime, to be less using formalistic approach, to try to understand what is really happening in the country, instead of trying to check some boxes in order to fulfill some policy objectives, because these things actually fire back. Because if we don't use the opportunity to clean the country from such an enormous influence of organized crime into the political system, but allow new political structures to get deeply involved as their predecessors, what is the future of the country? Why do we need to get to the EU if we won't be able to accept and enforce the rule of law in our country? So that is one of the messages for the international community. Don't deal with the formal things. The key changes are crucial if we really want to see any difference.
Thank you, Vanya. And now let's move to you, Clay. So one of the major topics of this conference and in the world these days is obviously the Russian war against Ukraine. So maybe to touch upon the implications of this war for the problem that we discussed here today. So Clay, you argue that at the beginning you mentioned that authoritarian regimes are involved on most of today's wars and crises. And I will quote you, you said that Putin's war against Ukraine is the front line of a global assault on freedom and democracy. So maybe if you could elaborate on that, what you mean by that.
Yeah, it's kind of a bold claim. Or maybe not. So in my last paper that I wrote, I tried to frame the global context of this as being a new Cold War of sorts. One that's different in the fact that there aren't these grand ideologies of communism and capitalism. Basically, the whole world is capitalist now. But instead of these grand ideologies, there's a competition between systems of governance. You have the democratic form of governance on one side, and then you have the authoritarian form of governance on the other. And each sides are consolidating, basically, and coming to a head. Basically about evenly, but if you follow all the data and everything on it, you see that, some autocracies are liberalizing and democracies are having a huge crisis of confidence right now. If you look around, it's happening in many different ways, and the world is just becoming more and more chaotic. I mean, you see China taking back Hong Kong. You see them saber rattling at Taiwan. You have the threats from North Korea against South Korea. You have Maduro seizing power in Venezuela. I mean, but then you have people pushing back with the protests in Hong Kong, the protests going on in Iran right now. And what I see is with Putin and with Russia, Putin has this strong irredentist approach to reclaiming lands that he feels were traditionally Russia's, and that's very dangerous because that has started lots of hot wars in our history, our world history. And so what I see is happening with the way I see this strike, this war against Ukraine is basically an authoritarian state imposing its will on a freely elected democratic state. And we haven't seen that in a very long time, and I'm afraid that that's the beginning of a larger hot war that could spiral out of control really fast because we have these two types of systems that have consolidated over these last 30 years and strengthened and hardened and created these networks of cooperation. And so that's kind of where I'm going with that.
Thank you. And then maybe to stick around with this topic, Alexander, now back to you. How did this war affect the transnational organized crime in the Eurasia, the region that you're expert on? And also there were some reports that came out that suggested or documented that Putin even relies on these criminal networks to administer the occupied territories in Ukraine. So maybe if you could touch upon those things.
Yes. Yes. Well, I mean, the impact is very, very significant. And we have seen these routes of trafficking shifting, right? Because, I mean, for example, Odessa seaport was a very, very important transshipment point for Latin American cocaine or Afghan opiates. That's not possible anymore. And as a consequence, we have seen increased seizures in Turkey, in some Baltic ports, so that can be kind of observable implication of what is happening in Ukraine. We see lots of shifting of illicit production of the commodities, right? Ukraine was one of the #1, actually, supplier of Europe with illicit cigarettes. Montenegro was mentioned, but Ukraine took over China, I think 2 years ago, in terms of supplying illicit tobacco to Europe. But since that decreased, Belarus stepped in, and we have seen a lot of illicit tobacco coming out of Belarus. So there's this kind of implications, of course. And we have actually done a research on that, and the report will be published on Tuesday, maybe, or Monday. That's by United Nations Institute of Crime Research. And what we found is very interesting, because looks like most of these things are coming back in terms of transnational crime. I mean, Ukraine is engaged in a heroic war. They show lots of ingenuity and resilience in this unjust war and invasion, but interestingly, some of this ingenuity and resilience also applies to illegal schemes, because we have seen a lot of this kind of bouncing back in a very short period of time. And now there are even more opportunities, right? There's lots of legal trade has been made illegal because of the sanctions, right? There's a bunch of products that cannot enter Russia anymore because they are banned. They cannot be exported. For example, luxury goods or Western-produced alcoholic products, right? They cannot be exported, and lots of products cannot leave Russia. But there's still demand on these products, and because of that, smugglers and traffickers can supply those products with very high profit margins. And of course, there's an interest to supply these products, right? There's also lots of looted commodities being traded. There's lots of coverage of grain stealing from Ukraine by Russian forces. So what gets less coverage is very important and interesting diversion and stealing of cultural artifacts from the museums in occupied parts of Ukraine, which is very, very alarming. Trafficking of humans and smuggling of humans got a boost. It's a bigger market now. There's a whole industry of smuggling of military-age men out of Ukraine, unfortunately. And what is less it's very difficult to verify, because there's a huge Russian disinformation campaign to prove that there's lots of arms trading going on. And that's with the purpose to undermine the Western military aid to Ukraine, and 99% of this is not true. But what we have seen, and there's some evidence in neighboring countries like in Moldova, that small arms trafficking is already a reality, and that's kind of unavoidable consequence of any conflict. And here in Balkans, you know it very well, right? So not heavy weaponry, but small arms trade is already much more than before. So I think the problem is that international police collaboration was not prioritized in the beginning of the war, because there was all emphasis on humanitarian and military aid. And some damage has been done. We don't know about this damage yet. We may know in the future. But now international police collaboration improved. But what I see is that we are in this kind of catch-up mode with very innovative and skillful smugglers. And we are not getting ahead of them yet, unfortunately. And there's lots of new and very innovative schemes of different types of smuggling and trafficking, different kind of commodities, which are very difficult to detect. But what has to be mentioned is that Ukrainian law enforcement has been doing extremely well, given all the pressure on them, right? And in some areas, they even overperformed, like cybercrime and cyber threats, for example. So there's a mixed evidence from the field.
But could you maybe comment on the second part of my question about the criminal networks operating in the...
Well,
if you can
briefly. It's not only the phenomenon in this part of the world. Illicit proxies and the use of illicit proxies is an established practice in many different places. The regions that are difficult to control or they're far away from the capital, for example, where the central authority doesn't have enough power to control, they have to ally themselves with different types of illicit proxies to establish control. And unfortunately, we have seen that in Crimea. We have seen, by Russia after the annexation. We have seen it in Luhansk and Donetsk. So this is, of course, ongoing.
Thank you. It seems we are running out of time faster than I had expected, so maybe let's move on to the last round of questions, and it has to do with how do we move forward in tackling these issues, if these are the challenges that we see. So we have, which you described as this new Cold War, kind of now starting to be hotter, where authoritarianism is fighting against democracies. We have these changes and rises in transnational organized crime, democratic backsliding. So how do we get out of this situation? How do we democratize these countries? Because if we are stuck in the state of permanent illegality, like it was mentioned, or these gray political zones, different names we used, but how do we move ahead? Vanya, maybe let's start with you and then zoom out to a more global perspective. Feel free to relate to the, again, most recent developments in Montenegro.
I think that introducing safeguards into the areas that are the most prone to organized crime, and we all know what those are, we all know where organized crime is mainly laundering their money in the areas where there is already a big money so they can hide it. So introducing safeguards, and I think in the case of Montenegro, one of the major safeguards is about transparency. It's not about relying on integrity of individuals who were involved in the crime or who might get involved in the crime. It's about exposing as much information as possible so anyone can see what is happening in these areas and blow the whistle if something suspicious actually occurs. I think that transparency is making it more complicated and therefore more expensive for organized crime to engage in their businesses, because they have to find ways to hide much more information than if they are operating in a system which is lacking transparency, which is closed, where only a few people actually have the access to information that could reveal organized crime. I don't think that the solution at this point, where we have major political actors being part of the problem, I don't think that the solution could rely on them. I think that's why we need to find ways to involve much bigger number of people and the society, and we need to find a way for international community to have some more targeted actions. There are many new tools that are available at the international level, and I think that they could be much more used in the case of the Balkans, and I'm referring to various prosecutorial authorities at the European level when it comes also to use of the EU funds, etc., and also to the new approach of the US administration. So these tools can be used more effectively in order to show that there will be price to pay for organized crime, as long as we allow criminals to live to a safe haven and keep the proceeds of a crime. There is no reason for them to actually stop with that business. That is why one of the major things is international cooperation in identifying the proceeds of crime and transparency in the ownership registries. We all know that they never own the property, or nearly never own the property in their own names. They own it in the names of proxies or in the names of shell companies. And actually, the ones that are facilitating a major part of the money laundering are the very well-known, experienced lawyers that are operating in the Western countries. And they help us. They help them open the offshore companies and use all this web of secrecy in order to hide proceeds of the crime. And that's where we can have actually these countries acting and making sure that those facilitators of organized crime in terms of the money laundering are facing with serious sanctions, which is not unfortunately all the time the case, because the cooperation is lacking, not only with our countries where a lot of information is leaked and it is hard to expect that there will be some fruitful cooperation with the authorities for the reasons I mentioned before, but among the EU countries themselves. It is not so complicated to identify the biggest companies of lawyers, of banks, and the others which are facilitating the crime, for example, in London. But what is happening with the political will to actually open up this information, which could then send the investors to some other countries. If we don't see a political will in the countries where they are hiding their proceeds of crime to reveal that information, unfortunately, we will continue to lose this battle.
Thank you, Vanya. Now, back to you, Alexander. So, taking into account this experience from Eurasia over the last 30 years, but also with these new geopolitical developments, what are the prospects for democratization? Any lessons learned from the region?
Well, I mean, there are some positive signs, right? I mean, if you look at Armenia, Moldova, right? I mean, there's some movement to a positive direction. There's some very good governance reforms happening. And you have some necessary conditions in place that you need for a successful anti-corruption reform. That is kind of political lead that is committed to anti-corruption fights, as well as the limited influence of the old guard, that is Ancien regime, who often act kind of reform spoilers. But that is necessary but not sufficient condition, especially if you want to maintain the progress. And we have seen, in case of Georgia, for example, some of this progress can be reversed if you don't have the right institutions in place, which is a dangerous thing to see. But I think for now, all eyes are on Ukraine. I mean, it depends how things go, but Ukraine has a chance to be a showcase of how things can be done in post-war country in a much cleaner environment, right? I mean, Ukraine already has moved out of this bad equilibrium that I mentioned before the war, because of legislation, because of anti-oligarchic law, other things. But now there is a real chance that this popularity of the Zelensky government and the political capital he has can be leveraged into pushing very painful reforms. And I think there's an understanding of that, and I think there's an understanding that post-war reconstruction and the huge funds related with that has to be spent in a transparent and accountable manner. If not, there's going to be a problem everywhere. And I mean, if you just think about it, I think Ukraine loses, by some estimates, $40 billion per year due to corruption. And last time I checked the numbers by Kiev School of Economics, who does a great job of compiling different numbers, trying to quantify the damage by the war, you don't need more than 40 billion to restore some of the key infrastructural damage done in Ukraine. So, I mean, no one says corruption can be solved entirely, but if you solve at least some issues related with it, you raise enough funds to do something. And again, there's lots of positive signs, and I'm very optimistic.
Thank you, Alexander. Now, finally, you, Clay. You do have a proposal also to add to this list of recommendations, and I think it's a very in the spirit, like it's a very an American way of doing things. If you can maybe explain to the audience.
Quickly, I'd like to echo Vanya's call for transparency. There's some great new academic empirical work out there on transparency as just being credible aggregate data. And we need more of that, and we need, for the exact reasons that Vanya said. And there are great promises behind blockchain technology and double ledger systems to be able to bring that technology to trade and payments all around the world. And so I think that's one great solution that should be explored. But thinking about what to do about the decline of democracy, start out by saying the worst thing about investing your money in Russia is that your money's in Russia. Right? The worst thing about investing your money in China is that your money's in China. Right? There's no transparency, there's very little due process, and that even that their criminals or their oligarchs will invest all of their money in Western countries buy houses there, send their kids to college in Western countries, live there, vacation there, everything tells you something about how bad the state of affairs is there and how bad everybody there wants the rule of law and the stability of transparency and democracy. But so I came up with a proposal that I was looking at the G7, right? So it was the G7 until it was the G8 when they added Russia, and then after the annexation of Crimea, kick Russia out, and it became the G7 again. Started looking into it. There's no actual formal process of the G7. It's just basically an informal gathering of 7 nations. There's no charter. So I propose that there should be a charter for the G7, that it should be exclusively for just democracies that are defined in the charter. And there should be a process built out of that for ascension to the G7 to give other countries some sort of specific steps that they have to take in order to get into the kind of similar to the EU, the beginnings of the EU. But there also has to be, the important part of it is there has to be a way to kick people out of the G7. And of course, you'd have to change the name every time you add anybody, but there has to be a process to kick people out if they fall below whatever the threshold is. So if there's unanimous agreement within the group that one country has dropped below some measure of, election transparency or financial transparency or anything like that, then they'd have a process to throw them out. And one of the other things I've sort of added to that over the years is term limits. So we always argue over how we define what a democracy is, and in the post-Cold War era, the interesting thing is that every single country around the world holds elections. Even North Korea holds elections. I mean, there's only one person on the box, right? But they still hold an election because everybody does it. And they call themselves a democracy for it. So one way to get around that is to add to the definition and add to these requirements of a new G7 is that you got to throw the bums out of office every once in a while. There has to be some kind of regular rotation of the executive, which is something that has been kind of missed in a lot of the discussions around this.
Thank you, but can you also maybe tell us your impressions about this? I think President Biden started this process last year, the Summit for Democracy, and then we are now in the first year. The second summit will take place in December. A line will be drawn, and we'll see how much of the commitments the government has made. Would that be something similar or along the lines that you propose, where we need to keep democracies in and the authoritarians out?
Yes. So the Summit for Democracies is a great first step, and it's a very bold. I think the ideas behind it are very well developed and good. But the problem is that it's a little too inclusive, in my opinion. So, I mean, this is my complaint about the G20, right, is that you bring in all of these non-democratic states that are introducing all this stuff into your discussions, that there needs to be this more isolated, consolidation of democracy. Because you look at the January 6th insurrection in the United States, you look at protests going on in democracies all around the world, there's a huge crisis within the established democracy, the established consolidated democracies that exist. And so that needs to be sort of healed first somehow, so these states can stand up and be a true beacon to attract the rest of the countries away from the lure of authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then now we have some 8 minutes maybe for questions and comments from the audience. So we are ready to hear. You can also contribute to the debate if you agree or disagree with some of the things that were mentioned. I don't see very well because of the light, but I don't think there are any. I have some. Sorry. Oh yeah. Sorry. You go.
I was going to ask questions,
yeah,
but I'm just waiting in.
Yeah, go.
In terms of one of the issues that Ukraine is going to face, in terms of membership to the European Union or the changes it has to make along the accession journey, I suppose, where would you think the country should start in terms of tackling corruption, tackling organised crime? What's kind of, from your opinion, to all three of you, where should they start, basically?
Thank you, Amanda. So anyone would like to take this question? Vanya, you maybe, or you, Alexander, you go, and then others?
Well, I guess there are many different ways, but I think Ukraine achieved a lot in terms of providing transparency, and there's very good legislation in place, right? But What it needs is to develop more institutions for the sake of accountability, because transparency and accountability, they are kind of like two wheels of the same cart. And if one malfunctions, then the cart will not move anywhere. But I mean, accountability and transparency are umbrella terms for so many things that is going in there, right? I mean, there's this influence of the reform spoilers that I mentioned, and there are very positive signs in this direction. Some of the oligarchs that we have seen having very bad influence on the reform in the country, they are kind of stepping away, at least for now. I think one of the major ones, he gave his media holding to the state. The others, they left the parliament. And then almost all of them are supporting Ukraine's war and contributing financially. So, and there's civil society and there's media. So these are all in there. But what is needed now, I think, is a major push. And the most the biggest argument I've heard is that this kind of push is not possible by the incumbents, the authority, the president, very often, because there's lots of different power centers, and you have to balance between those power centers to maintain your own power. But that's not the case anymore. And Zelensky has all political capital to cut through this, and I believe he will, because it's a historic chance.
Vanya, would you like maybe to contribute? I mean, because Montenegro has been in this process of joining the EU together with Serbia, you for a little longer, so maybe what are the priorities? What is something that the EU insists on?
Well, I don't know enough about Ukraine and the situation there, but I would say that for the fact there are some people there who are making huge money on smuggling and illegal activities, while some people are dying trying to protect their country. So I think that the first thing that needs to be done is to show them where the money goes, especially when the aid from abroad comes, which will be probably significant. Where the money goes, that the money doesn't end up in someone's pockets, the money that is supposed to be used for helping the people and for reconstructing the country, because that's what we experienced at the very beginning. Again, I don't know clearly at which stage the Ukraine is, but I don't think that they should engage in these exercises of adopting hectically laws, which are part of the acquis, because in that process there will be so many, if it's hectic like it was in the case of Montenegro, there will be so many opportunities to have loopholes left, to have overlapping of these laws, which are going to be further exploited, and it will probably take the European Commission at least 2 years on average per the law to actually understand that they didn't use the EU standards, but they misused it to cover up for the state capture. So I think it is very important to decide which reforms have to be undertaken. For example, if corrupted judges are elected new judges, so politicians don't involve in selection of judges, that's not a reform, that's a mockery. I think, especially in this situation, that the first thing is that people need to know where the money goes. They are dying and someone is making a huge money. So publishing the information that can show that would be the first step, I think is important.
Thank you, Vanya. So transparency is the way to go, I guess. All of us agree.
I'm a big believer in the transparency. If you don't have the institutions which are operating properly, if you don't have the accountability, or if you don't have enough accountability, only public pressure that is created over individuals can actually yield at least some accountability if institutions are captured. I don't know if that is the case in the Ukraine, but I'm talking from the experience of Montenegro and I think many Balkan countries.
Thank you. Any other comment or question? I still don't see any hands, but I wanted to go back to something else, Vanya, you mentioned, but also I would like to invite both of you to contribute. So you mentioned that we can count on individuals with integrity to kind of help us to get out of this tight spot. We have to change the system, but then you also mentioned that the system is also very corrupt. So if you have even some individuals with integrity, they soon become criminalized and corrupt as well. So it seems like a catch-22. So where do we start? How do we actually, move from this spot?
That's why I told you we have to change the system. First change the system and then talk about other things. I'll give you an example of Montenegro. In the case of the free trade zone of the Port of Var, we didn't introduce any reforms. With the very same laws, procedures, actually lack of procedures and huge loopholes, the new government decided to destroy the cigarettes that were taken from criminal groups. Instead of actually ending up destroying these cigarettes due to lack of these procedures and corruptibility of the individuals which were engaged by the new government, we ended up with cigarettes being stolen instead of being destroyed, because there is no procedure which would say clearly how many cigarettes, how the record-keeping system is working, who is in charge for transporting these cigarettes, how are the cooperation between police, intelligence, and the customs authorities working in that. So basically, that's just an example of how, if you have the system which is allowing individuals to make discretionary decisions in areas which are prone to organized crime, at some point they're going to exploit the system. That's why it is important to scan the areas where the organized crime is most frequently appearing, whether by laundering money or actually using these facilities for their criminal activities, to identify the weak spots, to introduce changes or procedures and laws targeted to these weak spots, but actually to publish information as well, because you want to involve more people to be able to control the system if you have people in the system that you don't know who you can rely on. That is why I'm such a big, so much arguing for transparency, because if I can see from Montenegro what is being imported in America or United Kingdom, for example, which ships are going and which goods are there carrying for which companies, and in Montenegro I cannot. How can I control and how I can monitor or whether there are some changes in trends of, for example, behavior of some companies that are related to organized crime? That's why I think, and if we rely only on the system, we saw what happened. That's why I think scanning the areas, pointing the weak spots, the major spots, changing targeted these major spots, not changing the whole system and taking forever, and then actually doing the targeted actions.
Thank you, Vanya. We have 45 seconds, if I'm correct. If anybody wants to...
It's great that you bring up free trade zones, because I've been looking at those for a long time, and this is one of the things that we don't know anything about. And when you talk about targeted specific areas, these are geographically delineated areas that are outside of the normal basis of customs control. And we don't even know how many exist in the world because nobody has bothered to actually count them. There's some like 5,000. But you could focus on these exact ones and use the technologies that we have to be able to trace and track and have transparency and the information that we need to stop all this stuff. And we have the specific points. And so I think that's a wonderful place to start with going after these groups.
Thank you. I think we are pretty much we have run out of time. Just wanted to thank you all, the three of you, for contribution to this panel. We have a lot to think about. And then I would just like to invite you to a coffee break that we are having right now. And then back here in 15 minutes with the next panel. Thanks once again.
Thank you. Let's do it. Take it.